You're gripping the stick of a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of American engineering beneath you, and through the scratched plexiglass canopy, you can count the individual farmhouses dotting the French countryside 18,000 feet below. The altimeter needle sits steady. The engine hums with that distinctive Pratt and Whitney sound that you've learned to trust more than anything else in this war. Your wingman flies 300 yards off your right wing, his aircraft a dark silhouette against the afternoon sky. From up here, you can see the whole tactical picture. The Seine snaking silver through the green patchwork, the dark rectangles of German airfields, the roads like threads connecting occupied towns. You feel exposed but safe, visible but untouchable. Every instinct, every hour of training, every briefing from men who flew in the last war tells you that altitude equals survival. What those instincts don't tell you is that you're hanging in the exact killing zone where American fighter pilots are dying faster than the training schools back in Arizona and Texas can graduate replacements. Summer of 1943 turned the skies over occupied Europe into an abattoir for American fighter crews. The statistics landed on desks at 8th Air Force headquarters in England, like casualty reports from a losing battle, which is exactly what they were. June through September, 214 fighter aircraft lost. Not mechanical failures, not fuel starvation, not weather. Combat losses. German fighters that had been perfecting their craft since the invasion of Poland were shredding American formations with a clinical efficiency that suggested the Luftwaffe had figured something out that the Army Air Forces had not. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, those were the names that appeared again and again in the intelligence summaries. German pilots flying those machines owned the airspace between 15,000 and 25,000 feet, like landlords collecting rent in blood. They'd climb above American formations, position themselves with the sun behind them so you couldn't see them coming until your peripheral vision caught the glint of canopy glass, and then they'd dive with cannon fire that could saw a P-47 in half. 20-millimeter shells hitting aluminum at closing speeds that gave you no time to react, no time to maneuver, barely enough time to understand that you were already dead. The bounce, they called it. 5 seconds of violence, and then the German fighter would zoom, climb back to altitude, while your squadron scattered and your wingman's aircraft tumbled earthward, trailing smoke and fuel and pieces. At Halesworth Airfield in Suffolk, Major Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group and watched the empty chairs multiply in the mess hall after every mission. Young men who'd been eating breakfast that morning just gone, their gear still hanging in their lockers, their letters home never to be finished. The tactical doctrine wasn't working. Every pilot who arrived in England got the same lecture about maintaining altitude advantage, fighting in the vertical plane, never surrendering your height to the enemy. Sacred principles written by men who'd flown in the Great War when speeds were slower and weapons less deadly. Following those principles in 1943 was getting everyone killed at a rate that would make the entire fighter campaign unsustainable before winter. Zemke started thinking thoughts that could get him relieved of command if he said them too loudly. What if the fundamental assumption was wrong? What if altitude wasn't safety, but a trap? What if the answer to the Luftwaffe's advantages lay not in climbing higher, but in going lower, all the way lower? The idea sounded like madness. Flying at low altitude meant sacrificing your ability to see threats developing. It meant that any mistake, any moment of inattention, would plant you and several tons of aircraft into French soil before your brain could process the error. It meant flying slow enough that German anti-aircraft batteries could track you with optical sights and blow you out of the sky with sustained fire. Every tactical manual, every training syllabus, every combat report from experienced pilots emphasized that low-level penetration by single-engine fighters was suicidal. But Zemke looked at those loss reports and asked himself a question that would change aerial warfare. Compared to what? Compared to the survival rates at altitude, because those numbers were unacceptable too. At least, if you were going to die, you might as well die trying something different. September 1943, Zemke pulled aside 3 of his most experienced pilots in a conversation that officially never happened. Captain Walker Mahurin, who already had 8 kills. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who'd survived getting shot to pieces by German fighters and somehow nursed his riddled P-47 back to England. Captain Jerry Johnson, no relation to Robert, who demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read aerial combat before it developed. Zemke told them to forget everything they knew about altitude discipline. Next mission, after they completed their assigned bomber escort duties and the formation turned for home, he wanted them to experiment. Take it down, not to medium altitude, not to what the manuals called minimum safe height. All the way down to the deck, skim the treetops, see what happens. If headquarters decided to court-martial anyone for violating standing orders, Zemke would take full responsibility. The 3 pilots looked at their commander, then at each other. They'd all lost friends in the past 6 weeks. Men they'd trained with, flown with, drank with in the evenings when the missions were done. Good pilots who'd followed doctrine precisely and died anyway. They agreed. September 27th, 1943. The mission was a standard fighter sweep, high cover for B-17s hitting industrial targets in the Ruhr. The bombers dropped their loads, turned west, and headed for England, with German fighters harassing them all the way to the coast. The P-47s flew top cover, keeping the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at bay, burning fuel and ammunition until it was time to head home. That's when Mahurin, Johnson and Johnson broke from the formation. Their wingmen followed, probably assuming their flight leaders had spotted targets. The 4 P-47s pitched over into dives that started at 18,000 feet and didn't level off until the altimeter was reading numbers that made no tactical sense. 200 feet above French farmland, then 100. Then so low that farmers working their fields dove into drainage ditches, thinking the Americans had lost control and were about to crash. The Thunderbolts leveled out with their propellers close enough to the ground that the slipstream kicked up dust from dirt roads. Throttles pushed forward to the stops, the big Pratt and Whitney engines howling, airspeed indicators climbing past 300 miles per hour and still accelerating. The pilots flew on instinct and reaction time, their eyes scanning ahead for obstacles, their hands making constant, tiny corrections. Their entire focus narrowed to the rushing blur of ground features and the need to stay airborne. Then Mahurin saw it. A German airfield near Beauvais, probably a forward operating base for fighters rotating through frontline duty. Focke-Wulf 190s lined up near the runway like toys arranged on a shelf. Fuel trucks positioned nearby, ground crew moving between the aircraft. Everything neat and organized and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The 3 P-47s, 6 aircraft total counting wingmen, screamed across the airfield boundary at propeller height. 850 caliber machine guns per aircraft. 48 guns total, opening fire simultaneously. The sound alone was probably enough to paralyze everyone on the ground. Then the bullets arrived. Armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer. Rounds designed to penetrate tank armor, hitting thin aluminum airframes. 4 Focke-Wulfs exploded into fireballs before the German anti-aircraft gunners could even sprint to their positions. Fuel trucks detonated in secondary explosions. The Americans pulled up just enough to clear the far boundary, stayed low, and disappeared over the horizon before the Germans could organize any response. They made it home. All 6 aircraft, 0 losses, 4 confirmed kills. And a tactical revolution had just been born through unauthorized experimentation and desperate creativity. Flying at treetop level wasn't just another altitude band. It was a completely different kind of warfare that turned every German advantage into a liability and exploited physics in ways that made conventional aerial combat doctrine irrelevant. When you're at 50 feet doing 350 miles per hour, the rules stop being rules and start being suggestions that will get you killed if you follow them. The Luftwaffe had invested heavily in radar coverage across occupied France. Freya early warning radars and Würzburg tracking radars positioned to give German fighter controllers a comprehensive picture of Allied air activity. These systems could spot bomber formations 80 miles out, calculate heading and altitude, and vector interceptors into position with enough warning time that the German fighters could climb to advantage, set up their attack runs, and hit the Americans when and where the Luftwaffe chose. It was a sophisticated system that had been refined through years of combat. It depended entirely on radar waves traveling in straight lines through the atmosphere. Radar waves do travel in straight lines. The Earth, however, is curved. This creates a phenomenon that radar operators learn to hate called ground clutter. The radar beam hits terrain features, buildings, trees, vehicles, everything between the antenna and the horizon, and all of those returns show up on the scope as hash, making it impossible to distinguish actual targets from noise. At altitude, this doesn't matter because there's nothing but air between the radar and the target. At 500 feet, the ground clutter starts becoming problematic. At 50 feet, you vanish completely. The radar might as well be blind. You become a ghost, invisible to the defensive network that's supposed to be giving the Germans their tactical advantage. A P-47 at full throttle covers 6 miles per minute at low altitude. Think about what that means for reaction time. Picture a German forward airfield, one of the dozens scattered across France for fighter operations. Bf-109S parked in revetments, pilots in the ready room playing cards or writing letters, ground crew performing maintenance, everything routine. At 18,000 feet, that base would get a 3-minute warning from radar, plenty of time for pilots to sprint to their aircraft, for ground crews to yank the wheel chocks, for everyone to prepare for whatever was coming. At 50 feet, the first warning anyone gets is the sound. The distinctive roar of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine coming over the tree line. From that sound reaching your ears to the moment 850 caliber machine guns start tearing your airfield apart, 11 seconds. Not enough time to start an engine, not enough time to man an anti-aircraft gun properly, barely enough time for your brain to process that you're about to experience combat. American pilots started catching German fighters on the ground with their wheels still chocked, with pilots still walking toward their cockpits carrying their flight gear, with mechanics still working on engines with access panels open. It stopped being aerial combat and became something closer to murder, which was exactly the point. You don't win wars by fighting fair. You win by exploiting every advantage and creating situations where the enemy doesn't get to fight back. The speed at ground level became its own form of protection. German anti-aircraft crews trained extensively on tracking and leading fast-moving targets, but their training assumed altitude. Flak calculations require knowing the target's speed, altitude, and direction, then computing where that target will be when your shell reaches that altitude. It's trigonometry and practiced estimation. At 10,000 feet, a skilled crew can bracket a target and score hits through sustained fire. At 50 feet, every calculation breaks down. By the time an 88mm shell reaches where you were supposed to be, you've traveled a quarter mile past that point. The shell explodes behind you, and you're already setting up your gun run on whatever target you came to destroy. Light anti-aircraft fire, the 20mm automatic cannons and 37mm guns that fired tracer streams depended on visual tracking. The gunner watches the target, leads it based on experience and training, and walks his fire into the target's flight path. It requires smooth, predictable target movement and enough time to observe and adjust. An AP-47 at ground level gives you neither. The aircraft appears as a dark blur against terrain, moving faster than human reaction time can comfortably process, gone before the gunner's muscles can adjust his aim. The few rounds that do get fired are shooting at where you were, not where you are. Then there's the problem of pursuit. Say a German pilot does manage to spot you, either from altitude or from another low-level patrol. He's got position, he's got speed from his dive, he's got you potentially dead to rights. Except he's now committed to following you into an environment where there's no forgiveness for mistakes. At 50 feet, every maneuver risks flying into terrain. That hillside, that tree line, that church steeple, everything is a potential collision at closing speeds, measured in hundreds of miles per hour. The American pilot, already flying at that altitude, has had minutes to adapt to the mental pressure. The German pilot, diving down, is suddenly operating in a regime where his altitude training becomes a liability. Most pulled out. Self-preservation overrode aggression when the alternative was flying into a French hillside because you misjudged a turn by 10 feet. The psychological pressure reversed completely. Hunters became hunted. German pilots who'd spent years perfecting high-altitude interception tactics found themselves terrified of an environment where American pilots seemed comfortable. The Americans discovered they could use terrain the way submarines use depth. Spot a German fighter, drop into a river valley and follow the curves, using the terrain to break visual contact and force the pursuer to either lose you or follow you into a twisting maze where speed becomes dangerous instead of advantageous. Villages became tactical cover, fly through the streets using buildings as shields, church steeples, water towers, tree lines, ridges. Everything became part of the tactical environment in ways that had never been explored in peacetime training. The Luftwaffe had spent 3 years owning the sky over Europe. The Americans stole the ground and weaponized it. And at 50 feet, physics didn't care about doctrine, experience, or who had better training. Physics cared about speed, surprise, and whether you could avoid hitting the Earth at 350 miles per hour. Republic Aviation had never intended the P-47 Thunderbolt for this kind of work. The design specifications called for a high-altitude interceptor, a massive fighter that could escort bombers at 25,000 feet, where the air gets thin and turbochargers separate the aircraft that can fight from the aircraft that can barely fly. The R2800 engine, a monster that generated 2,000 horsepower, was optimized for altitude performance. The whole aircraft was built around the concept of fighting in the stratosphere, where American industrial capacity could produce better superchargers and more reliable systems than Germany's overtaxed manufacturing base. When pilots started bringing these 7-ton machines down to treetop level in late 1943, they came back with damage that should have been mission kills: belly panels torn and shredded from clipping tree branches, oil coolers punctured from debris strikes, hydraulic lines that had come within millimeters of being severed by impacts that the pilots sometimes didn't even remember. The maintenance crews looked at this damage and realized something remarkable. The P-47 was surviving impacts that would have disintegrated lighter fighters. The sheer mass and robust construction meant that what would kill a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt just made a Thunderbolt angry. Republic's engineers, working with combat feedback from units in England, realized they had accidentally created the perfect low-level attack fighter. They just needed to finish the job properly. Starting in December 1943, Republic began adding a 1/4-inch armor plate to the belly and lower engine cowling of new production aircraft, and retrofit kits went to operational units in England for existing machines. This wasn't armor designed to stop German cannon fire. No practical amount of armor could do that. This was protection against France itself. Trees, power lines, fence posts, stone walls, all the obstacles that pilots were hitting or nearly hitting on every low-level mission. The armor meant that when, not if, You scraped a treetop at 300 miles per hour, you might keep your oil pressure and hydraulic fluid long enough to get home. Engineers added reinforced brackets around the oil cooler assembly after analyzing 3 separate incidents where pilots had landed with punctured cooling systems from tree strikes. One lieutenant, Francis Gabreski, landed at Halesworth with a 6-foot section of tree branch wedged in his landing gear, the wood still green with leaves. The impact had been hard enough to dent aluminum, but not hard enough to penetrate the armor protecting the critical hydraulic lines. He'd flown 40 miles like that, completely unaware he was carrying half a French tree home. The gun sight modification was more subtle but equally important. The standard N9 reflector sight was calibrated for aerial gunnery, deflection shooting where you lead a maneuvering target in 3-dimensional space. You're calculating range, closure rate, target angle, all while pulling Gs in combat. It's difficult shooting that requires practice and instinct. At ground level, your targets weren't maneuvering. They were stationary, parked aircraft, locomotives sitting on railroad tracks, fuel trucks, supply depots. But you only had them in view for 2 seconds, while you were traveling at a mile every 10 seconds. The sight needed to help you acquire and fire in that impossibly brief window. By February 1944, Republic was installing modified K-14 gyroscopic gun sights with adjusted ranging calculations. The new sight essentially turned the P-47 into a gun platform that could put rounds on target with minimal pilot input. Put the pipper on the target, squeeze the trigger, 850 caliber Brownings erase whatever you're looking at. The sight compensated for speed and range automatically, letting pilots focus on flying the aircraft and identifying targets instead of calculating lead angles. The wing racks received attention too. The P-47 could carry bombs, up to 2,000 pounds of ordnance, on external racks, but the standard release mechanisms were designed for high-altitude bombing, where you pickled the bombs at 10,000 feet and let ballistics do the work. Drop a 500-pound bomb at 50 feet, and the blast wave will kill you as efficiently as it kills your target. Engineers developed skip bombing techniques adapted from tactics the Pacific Theater was using against Japanese shipping. You'd approach a hardened target, a bridge or bunker or railway junction at maximum speed and minimum altitude. At the last possible second, you'd release and let the bomb skip across the ground like a stone skipping across water, except it was skipping across concrete or earth straight into whatever you wanted destroyed. The trick was in the timing and the angle. Get it wrong, and either the bomb bounces over the target or the blast wave catches your tail. The P-47 D-25 variant that started reaching operational units in March 1944 incorporated reinforced wing spars specifically to handle the structural stress of pullouts from these insane low-level attack runs. Diving at a target from altitude, releasing ordnance or firing guns, then pulling up hard to clear obstacles and get back to safety puts tremendous stress on the airframe. The wings needed to handle that repeatedly, mission after mission, without developing fatigue cracks that would eventually cause structural failure. But the most critical modification wasn't something Republic Aviation could install in a factory. It was tactical training. By April 1944, replacement pilots arriving in England weren't going straight to operational squadrons anymore. They were going through a qualification course at Atcham, where experienced combat pilots who'd survived months of low-level operations taught them how to not die. The training was brutally simple. You flew navigation runs at 50 feet across the English countryside until reading terrain at high speed became instinctive instead of terrifying. You practiced identifying landmarks and waypoints while traveling 6 miles per minute, with your attention divided between the map strapped to your knee and the ground rushing at you. You flew formation at hedge height with other students until maintaining position at that altitude felt normal instead of suicidal. You practiced snap shooting at ground targets, learning to acquire and fire in 1-second windows because that's all you'd get over France. You flew these training missions every day until the instructors were satisfied that you understood the fundamental principle. Altitude kills you, speed saves you, and the P-47 can absorb damage that would atomize any other fighter in the inventory. The instructors were men who'd survived 2 or 3 months of actual combat operations, which made them ancient by fighter pilot standards. Their lessons were direct and uncompromising. Trust the aircraft because it's tougher than you are. Master the altitude because hesitation is death. Learn to see threats developing before they develop because your reaction time is the only thing between survival and a smoking crater in French farmland. If you couldn't handle the psychological pressure of low-level flight, better to discover that over England, where crashing just meant embarrassment, instead of over France, where it meant being dead or captured. Some pilots washed out of the program. They had the flying skills, but couldn't handle the mental stress of sustained low-altitude operations. The instructors sent them to bomber escort duties where altitude discipline was still the doctrine. No shame in that. Different missions required different psychological profiles, and it was better to know your limitations before combat demonstrated them fatally. The ones who graduated from the course and joined operational squadrons arrived with a qualification that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. They could fly a 7-ton fighter aircraft at treetop level in combat conditions and not only survive but accomplish their missions. That capability was about to be tested on a scale that would determine whether an invasion succeeded or failed. April 8, 1944. Colonel Hubert Zemke had spent 6 months refining the low-level tactics from desperate experiment into systematic doctrine. Pilots rotating through the qualification course, intelligence sections analyzing German airfield locations and update patterns, maintenance crews learning to turn around aircraft in 20 minutes instead of an hour. Everything had been building toward this, a coordinated strike that would demonstrate whether the hedge-hopping concept could work at operational scale against prepared defenses. Intelligence reported that Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26, 2 of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings with combat experience dating back to the Battle of Britain, were rotating squadrons through forward bases near Évreux and Bernay. These weren't training units or second-line formations. These were veteran pilots flying the best aircraft Germany produced, based at airfields that German engineers had been fortifying since 1940. The fields had anti-aircraft batteries, early warning systems, dispersed revetments for aircraft protection, everything that doctrine said should make them difficult targets. Zemke planned something that the Germans weren't prepared for: overwhelming coordination. 48 P-47s from 3 different fighter groups, the 56th, 78th, and 353rd, launching simultaneously on what the mission brief described as an armed reconnaissance sweep. No bombers to escort, no high-altitude patrol sectors to maintain, just pure hunting. The formations would cross the French coast at medium altitude to avoid arousing suspicion, then split up and drop to the deck, hitting targets across a 60-mile radius within a 15-minute window. The P-47s crossed into French airspace at 12,000 feet, looking like a standard fighter sweep. German radar tracked them. Controllers noted the formation size and heading, nothing unusual. Then the American formations dissolved. 4 ship flights peeling off in different directions, noses dropping, altimeters unwinding as they dove toward the deck. By the time German controllers realized something strange was happening, it was too late to respond effectively. The first flight hit Évreux airfield at 0647 hours. 16 Bf-109s on the ground in various states of readiness, some taxiing toward the runway for morning patrol, others still being fueled, with ground crew dragging hoses, several with pilots climbing into cockpits, going through pre-start procedures. The P-47s materialized out of the morning haze, doing 360 miles per hour at propeller height. The German gunners never fired a shot. In 90 seconds, 11 Messerschmitts were burning wrecks and the Americans were gone, already racing toward their next targets at an altitude where German radar couldn't track them. The beauty of the coordinated timing was that it exploited the Luftwaffe's centralized command structure. When Évreux got hit, the controllers tried to warn other bases and vector fighters to intercept. But the Americans were already hitting Bernay. 8 minutes after Évreux burned, Bernay was burning. 4 minutes after that, Beaumont-le-Roger got hit. The German controllers were trying to respond to threats that had already attacked and vanished, like trying to swat flies with a sledgehammer, while the flies systematically destroyed everything you owned. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of Zemke's original 3 test pilots from September, led a flight that caught a starful of FW-190s at Conches airfield during their morning briefing. The German pilots were standing beside their aircraft in a group, probably discussing the day's patrol sectors, when Johnson's flight screamed over the boundary fence at 100 feet. The gun camera footage from that attack is difficult to watch even decades later. Focke-Wulfs erupting into fireballs, pilots sprinting for cover with nowhere to run, fuel trucks exploding and spreading burning fuel across the flight line. Johnson's after-action report was clinical to the point of being cold. Destroyed 4 aircraft on ground, probably destroyed 2 more. Heavy damage to fuel storage facilities. No enemy fire encountered. Time over target, 11 seconds. 11 seconds that erased 2 years of pilot training and aircraft production. 11 seconds that cost Germany resources it could no longer replace at anything approaching sustainable rates. By 09:20 hours, P-47s had struck 7 different airfields across a 40-mile radius. The Luftwaffe pilots who did manage to get airborne found themselves trying to chase targets they couldn't see, flying at altitudes where one mistake meant instant death, pursuing enemies who seemed comfortable in an environment that terrified anyone sane. Most pulled up and returned to base, assuming they still had a base to return to. The week-long offensive that followed, what American pilots started calling the Chattanooga choo-choo runs after they expanded beyond airfields to hitting locomotives and railway infrastructure, claimed 47 confirmed German aircraft destroyed on the ground. 23 locomotives destroyed, each one a bottleneck in Germany's increasingly desperate logistics network. Countless trucks, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, all turned into craters and scorch marks. The cost to the Americans was 3 P-47s. 1 to anti-aircraft fire, 1 to flying into a power line the pilot never saw, 1 to engine failure on the flight home that might have been combat damage or might have been mechanical failure. The loss ratio was 15-1 in favor of the Americans, and every Luftwaffe base commander in France was suddenly screaming for more anti-aircraft guns, more camouflage, more anything that might stop the hedge-hopping Thunderbolts from appearing without warning and destroying months of work in seconds. The desperation in intercepted German radio traffic was obvious to Allied intelligence officers. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had absolutely no idea how to adapt. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces and one of Germany's most experienced combat pilots, read the April loss reports with the understanding that his air force was facing something more dangerous than just tactical defeats. Losing aircraft in air combat was sustainable if painful. You could replace aircraft from factories, train new pilots in schools, rotate veteran units to rest and refit. But losing aircraft on the ground, along with the fuel trucks to refuel them, the ammunition to rearm them, the ground crews to maintain them, that was hemorrhaging capability faster than Germany's collapsing industrial and logistics network could replace. On April 19th, 1944, Galland issued Directive 487 to all Jagdverband commanders in France. Relocate aircraft dispersal areas at least 800 meters from runways. Increase anti-aircraft coverage on likely approach paths. Establish visual observer networks in villages surrounding every airfield. It was a tactical band-aid on an arterial bleed, and Gallen knew it. But doing something felt better than doing nothing while American fighters systematically destroyed his air force on the ground. The anti-aircraft repositioning happened first because it was the easiest to implement. Luftwaffe ground forces dragged 37mm and 20mm automatic cannons away from airfield perimeters and placed them a kilometer out in fields and along tree lines, hoping to catch the P-47s before they reached attack range. It didn't work the way planners hoped. The Americans simply flew lower, using terrain folds and natural depressions to mask their approach until they were already inside the flak envelope. By the time the guns started tracking, the Thunderbolts had already fired and were screaming past at speeds the manual traverse couldn't match. Worse, positioning anti-aircraft batteries in open fields made them targets. P-47 pilots started actively hunting the flak positions, treating them as priority targets worth expending ammunition on. Strafing runs with 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds turned the gun crews into casualties faster than the crews could be replaced. One battery commander near Dreux reported losing 17 men over 3 weeks without scoring a confirmed hit on an American fighter. The survivors requested transfer to any other duty. Nobody wanted to man guns that attracted P-47s like blood-attracting sharks. The observer network was more effective in theory, but created its own problems. The Luftwaffe recruited French civilians to watch roads and fields near airfields and telephone warnings when they heard aircraft engines. Some collaborated willingly, some were coerced, some did it because the Germans paid better than starvation. The system gave maybe 30 extra seconds of warning. Just barely enough time for pilots to sprint away from their aircraft, which meant they lived, but their planes still burned. The French resistance figured out the observer network within days. They started feeding false reports, sending German personnel scrambling to dispersal areas for phantom attacks, while real P-47s hit different bases entirely. By mid-May, the observer network had been so thoroughly compromised with disinformation that German commanders stopped trusting it entirely. You can't build a defensive system on intelligence you know is poisoned. The dispersal tactic was the most desperate measure and the most damaging to German operational capability. Instead of parking aircraft in neat rows near the runway for efficient maintenance and rapid response, ground crews started hiding individual fighters in tree groves, barns, and camouflaged revetments scattered across the countryside. It saved aircraft from strafing runs. It also destroyed readiness. A Bf-109, hidden in a farmer's barn 2 kilometers from the runway, needed 20 minutes minimum to reach the flight line, get fueled, armed, and airborne. The entire purpose of a fighter base was rapid response to intercept threats. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe into choosing between protecting their aircraft and actually using them. They chose protection, which meant that even the fighters that survived weren't flying combat missions. Gallen tried one more countermeasure in late May, Operation Würger, a plan to use specially modified FW-190s fitted with additional belly armor and heavy cannons to hunt the hedgehoppers. The theory was sound. These heavily armed fighters would fly low-altitude patrols near vulnerable airfields and catch P-47s during their attack runs, when the Americans were focused on ground targets and not watching for aerial threats. It failed spectacularly in practice. The armored FW-190s were slower and less maneuverable than standard variants, and at 50 feet, those disadvantages were fatal rather than acceptable. In the first week of Würger operations, the Luftwaffe lost 6 of their specially modified fighters without scoring a single kill. The program was quietly cancelled after 10 days. There was no effective counter to hedge-hopping because the tactic didn't fight fair. It exploited every weakness in the Luftwaffe's defensive system simultaneously. The Germans could adapt to one element, maybe 2, with enough effort and resources. But not all of them at once. Not the radar invisibility and the speed and the surprise and the terrain masking and the psychological pressure all combined into a single tactical approach that turned their own defensive doctrine into a trap. By June 1944, Luftwaffe commanders in France had accepted a grim reality that appeared in their reports to Berlin with increasing frequency. Their aircraft weren't safe on the ground. They weren't safe taking off or landing. The Americans could strike anywhere at any time with minimal warning. Air superiority, which Germany had enjoyed over Europe since 1940, had transformed into something closer to air terror. The sky belonged to the Americans, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do about it except die or hide. Living at 50 feet meant learning to survive threats that had nothing to do with the Luftwaffe and everything to do with physics, biology, and the fact that France was full of things that could kill you if you hit them at 350 miles per hour. You could master every tactical principle, execute perfect gun runs, and still die because reality doesn't care about your skills. Lieutenant James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group learned this lesson on May 3, 1944, when a bird strike shattered his windscreen over the Loire Valley. 1 second he had clear visibility and full control. The next second there was blood and feathers and broken plexiglass fragments in his face, his eyes half blinded by the impact, wind tearing at him with hurricane force through the shattered canopy. Everything in his training said to climb to safe altitude where you had time and space to deal with the emergency. His instinct, developed through months of low-level operations, told him that climbing would just make him a target for any German fighters at altitude. He kept the stick steady, flew the aircraft on instruments, while his eyes streamed tears from the wind blast, and somehow made it to an emergency landing strip. He landed with glass shards still embedded in his cheeks and blood running down his face. The bird had been a crow. Medical examination showed it had hit the windscreen doing a combined closure speed of over 400 miles per hour. The plexiglass had held just long enough to slow the impact so it didn't kill him. After that incident, pilots started calling birds flying flak and developed an instinct for reading bird behavior. If you saw them scatter suddenly, something was there that they were avoiding. Trees, power lines, another aircraft, something dangerous. The birds knew the terrain better than you did because they lived in it every day. Watch the birds, and maybe you'd see the obstacle in time to avoid it. Power lines were worse because you couldn't see them until you'd already hit them, and by then it was too late for anything except prayer. France's rural electrical grid was a web of death strung between wooden poles at exactly the altitude American pilots were flying. The wires were thin, nearly invisible against the landscape, tensioned strong enough to slice through aluminum like cheese wire through soft cheese. In April and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 9 P-47s to power line strikes. Not enemy action, not combat losses, just administrative casualties listed as struck obstacle during low-level flight. Nobody got a medal for dying that way. You just became a statistic. Lieutenant William O'Brien hit a power line near Chartres that wrapped around his propeller and pulled down 3 telephone poles before the wire snapped. The jolt nearly tore the engine off the airframe, the vibration so severe that instruments shattered and the controls fought him like the aircraft was trying to kill him. He flew 10 miles with the aircraft shaking itself apart before the vibrations forced him to bail out. Rescue crews found the P-47 in a crater with 40 feet of copper wire still tangled in the prop blades. The psychological pressure of hedge-hopping wasn't the fear of dying in combat. Every fighter pilot lived with that fear from the day they put on wings. It was the fear of dying stupidly. At altitude, if you got killed, it was combat. Someone could write your mother a letter about how you died, fighting the enemy, how you were brave, how it was quick. At 50 feet, if you got killed, it was because you misjudged a hillside by 10 feet, or didn't see the chimney, or got distracted for half a second. Your wingman would report that you flew into the ground, and everyone would know you'd made a mistake. That knowledge created a mental burden that accumulated mission after mission until some pilots couldn't carry it anymore. The 56th Fighter Group had 3 pilots in May 1944 who requested transfer to bomber escort duties, high-altitude missions, where doctrine was doctrine again and altitude meant safety. One of them was a captain with 14 confirmed kills, an ace twice over. He told the flight surgeon, completely seriously, that he would rather face the entire Luftwaffe at 20,000 feet than fly another mission at tree level. The surgeon approved the transfer without judgment because everyone in the squadron understood. Some men could handle that particular flavor of stress, some couldn't. It didn't make you a coward to know your limitations. The physical toll was equally brutal in ways that normal combat flying never matched. Flying at maximum speed and minimum altitude for extended periods, while constantly scanning for terrain and threats, created exhaustion that went beyond simple tiredness. Your body dumped adrenaline continuously for 2 hours. Your eyes strained to track ground features rushing at you at 6 miles per minute. Your hands and arms fought constant micro-corrections to keep the aircraft stable at an altitude where a 2-degree error meant instant death. Pilots would land after a hedge-hopping mission and discover their flight suits completely soaked with sweat, despite flying in 50-degree weather. Some couldn't hold coffee cups steady for an hour after landing, their hands shaking from muscle fatigue and adrenaline crash. Flight surgeons documented cases of pilots with tremors so severe they couldn't write their after-action reports and had to dictate them to clerks instead. Then there were the ones who adapted too well. The pilots who'd survived so many low-level missions that they started feeling invincible. They'd fly at 30 feet instead of 50 because they'd gotten away with it before. They'd strafe targets in broad daylight that should have been bypassed as too heavily defended. Squadron commanders watched for this carefully because overconfidence at that altitude had a 100% mortality rate. It was just a question of when, not if. Major Gerald Johnson grounded one of his best pilots for a week in May after the pilot flew under a railway bridge instead of over it during a strafing run on a German supply train. Not because he'd violated regulations or failed to complete his mission, because he'd stopped being afraid. At 50 feet, a healthy fear was the only thing keeping you alive. Lose that edge, get comfortable with the constant proximity to death, and you became a statistic waiting to happen. The pilot complained about being grounded right up until one of his squadron mates flew into a hillside 2 days later because he'd gotten cocky about reading terrain. After that, the pilot thanked Johnson for the enforced rest. June 6, 1944, 05:30 hours. Dawn breaking over Normandy, and 156,000 Allied troops hitting 5 invasion beaches in the largest amphibious assault in human history. The entire operation, years of planning and preparation, billions of dollars in equipment and resources, thousands of ships and aircraft, all of it depended on one absolutely critical assumption: that the Luftwaffe wouldn't show up in meaningful numbers, not because they couldn't, but because American fighters would make any German attempt to reach the beaches a one-way suicide mission. General Eisenhower had bet the entire invasion on air supremacy, and the hedge-hopping P-47 tactics were about to cash that check. Before the first landing craft touched sand, 289 P-47 Thunderbolts were already screaming across northern France at treetop level, systematically hitting every Luftwaffe base within 150 miles of the coast. The strike started at 04:45 hours, 90 minutes before H-hour, time to catch the Germans at their most vulnerable moment. Dawn patrol preparations, when fighters were being fueled and armed, when pilots were walking to their aircraft, when everyone's focus was on the massive Allied fleet that radar had been tracking all night, rather than on threats developing overland. At Creel Airfield, 35 miles north of Paris, a group of Bf-109s was taxiing into takeoff position when 8 P-47s from the 78th Fighter Group materialized out of the pre-dawn gloom like demons from nightmares. The German pilots had their canopies open, checking instruments, completely focused on their pre-flight procedures. They died without ever understanding what killed them. 18 Bf-109s destroyed in the time it takes to read this sentence. Burning wrecks scattered across the runway and taxiways, secondary explosions as fuel and ammunition cooked off in the fires. At Beauvais, at Abbeville, at Amiens, the same scene repeated with mechanical precision. German fighters burning before they could get airborne, before they could defend the beaches that were about to be lost, before they could contest the skies over the largest invasion in history. The hedge-hopping tactics evolved in real time that morning into something more sophisticated than simple strafing runs. Fighter groups coordinated continuous sweeps where one flight would finish its attack and pull off target just as another flight was coming inbound from a different direction. The Germans never got a respite, never had time to organize a coherent response. Radio intercepts captured Luftwaffe controllers screaming contradictory orders, trying to vector fighters to intercept threats coming from everywhere simultaneously, their voices rising in pitch and desperation as more bases reported attacks. At 0620 hours, Jagdgeschwader 26 attempted to launch a Staffel from Lille-Vandeville to attack the invasion fleet. They got 4 aircraft airborne before P-47s hit the field and destroyed everything still on the ground. The 4 that managed to launch were bounced by high-altitude P-51 Mustangs that had been waiting above the cloud layer specifically to catch any German fighters that made it into the air. None of those 4 aircraft reached the coast. None of the pilots survived. The systematic destruction wasn't just about killing aircraft and pilots. It was about breaking the Luftwaffe's will to even try. By 0800 hours, as American troops were fighting through the surf at Omaha Beach and struggling up the bluffs under German machine gun fire, the Luftwaffe had managed to put exactly 2 aircraft over the invasion fleet. 2 reconnaissance planes that were promptly shot down by naval anti-aircraft fire before they could radio back any useful information. The German leadership reportedly spent the morning in furious confusion, demanding to know where their air force was, why there was no aerial resistance to the largest invasion in military history. The answer was simple, but difficult to accept. The Luftwaffe was burning on airfields across France, destroyed on the ground by American fighters that had spent 7 months perfecting the art of low-level attack. The Hedgehoppers flew 847 individual sorties that day, an operational tempo that should have been physically impossible. They didn't fly neat 8-hour missions with rest periods and crew rotations. They flew, landed, rearmed in 20 minutes while ground crews worked with manic intensity, refueled, and launched again. Some pilots flew 4 complete sorties before sunset. Ground crews worked until several literally collapsed from exhaustion, and their squadron mates picked them up and carried them to medical tents while other crew members took over their positions. The daylight hours saw P-47s expand beyond airfields to systematically destroying anything German that moved toward Normandy. Trains caught on exposed tracks and shredded with .50 caliber fire until the locomotives were scrap and the cars were burning. Truck convoys that scattered into forests when they heard engines, only to have the P-47s circle back and hunt them vehicle by vehicle. Fuel depots that went up in massive fireballs visible for miles. Bridges that collapsed into rivers after skip bombing attacks. If it could support a German counterattack, it became a target. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski led a flight that caught a German panzer column attempting to move toward Caen in broad daylight. probably gambling that the Allies would be too busy with the beaches to patrol inland. The tanks were buttoned up, crews sealed inside, moving at road march speed with no air cover because there was no air cover available. Gabreski's flight didn't have bombs, just 850 caliber machine guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. They strafed the column from angles that hit the thin top armor of the engine decks. 3 Panzer IVs brewed up, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that sent turrets flying through the air. The column scattered into tree cover and didn't move again until after dark, and by then they were 12 hours behind schedule for reaching the beachhead. Multiply that scene across 50 different roads, and you understand why German reinforcements that should have reached Normandy in 6 hours took 3 days, arriving piecemeal and exhausted instead of as concentrated formations. As the sun set on June 6th, the Luftwaffe had managed to fly 319 sorties over Normandy. The Allies had flown 14,674. The difference was overwhelming and decisive. The invasion succeeded because the sky over those beaches belonged entirely to the Allies, and the sky belonged to them because P-47 pilots had spent 7 months learning how to kill an air force before it could take off. D-Day wasn't won just on the beaches by infantry fighting through obstacles and machine gun fire. It was won at 50 feet over France, one burning Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf at a time. The hedge-hopping revolution didn't end when the war did. It fundamentally rewrote doctrinal thinking about close air support and battlefield interdiction in ways that echo through modern air combat. By August 1944, every Allied air force in Europe had studied the American tactics and adopted some variation for their own operations. British Typhoons and Tempests started flying similar low-level strikes against German positions. Soviet IL-2 Sturmovix, already designed for ground attack, refined their approach patterns based on American after-action reports that Soviet intelligence obtained through official channels, and probably unofficial ones too. The Luftwaffe itself tried to copy the tactics in their remaining operational sectors, but by late 1944, they lacked everything needed to make it work. Not enough fuel to train pilots in low-level flying. Not enough aircraft to risk on experimental tactics. Not enough time to develop the institutional knowledge that the Americans had paid for in crashed aircraft and dead pilots during the learning curve. The Germans understood what the Americans were doing, but couldn't replicate it. The P-47 hedgehoppers had demonstrated something that changed air power doctrine permanently. Air superiority wasn't about controlling the sky above the battlefield. It was about controlling every cubic foot of airspace from ground level upward. You couldn't win just at altitude anymore. You had to dominate everywhere, from the stratosphere down to the terrain itself, and you needed aircraft and tactics that could fight effectively across that entire altitude band. The casualty statistics, despite the brutal learning curve and the constant danger, validated the entire tactical approach. Between April and August 1944, P-47 groups flying hedge-hopping missions destroyed 1,823 German aircraft on the ground, 23,115 locomotives, each one a critical node in Germany's collapsing logistics network. Over 9,000 trucks and armored vehicles, hundreds of bridges and fuel depots. They had systematically dismantled Germany's ability to move forces and supplies in France. The cost was 289 P-47s, lost over the same period, 114 to anti-aircraft fire, 87 to ground obstacles, power lines, and mechanical failures during low-level flight, 67 to enemy fighters that caught them during vulnerable moments, 21 to unknown causes, aircraft that simply disappeared and were never found. A loss rate of roughly 15% over 5 months of the most intense combat operations in aviation history to that point. Brutal numbers that represented young men dying in aircraft crashes and combat, but sustainable from a strategic perspective. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could replace losses faster than the enemy, and by mid-1944, that was definitely not Germany. More importantly, every German aircraft destroyed on the ground was an aircraft that never intercepted Allied bombers, never strafed Allied troops, never contested the skies over France. The hedgehoppers were trading their losses for German capability at ratios that made the exchange strategically favorable, even accounting for the human cost. The Korean War saw these lessons applied immediately. American pilots flying F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets used low-level interdiction tactics against North Korean and Chinese supply lines with devastating effectiveness. The speeds were higher, jets instead of propeller aircraft, but the fundamental approach remained identical to what Hub Zemke's pilots had developed over France a decade earlier. Fly low enough to avoid radar detection, fast enough to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, and hit targets before defenders could react effectively. Vietnam saw another generation of American pilots flying low-level interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs screaming through mountain valleys at treetop height, dropping ordnance on truck parks and supply depots, using terrain the same way the P-47 pilots had used French farmland. The terminology changed. Nap of the earth flying replaced hedgehopping in official doctrine, but the DNA was pure 1944 Thunderbolt tactics adapted for new aircraft and new enemies. Modern close air support doctrine carries the fingerprints of those P-47 pilots in every line. The A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s specifically for low-altitude ground attack against Soviet armor, incorporated every lesson learned over France. Heavy titanium armor protection underneath to survive ground fire. Redundant flight control systems so battle damage wouldn't cause loss of control. Weapons optimized for ground targets rather than air-to-air combat. Training syllabuses that emphasize terrain masking and high-speed approaches to minimize exposure. Air Force survival schools still teach the tactical principles that Hub Zemke's pilots discovered through trial and error and paid for with their lives. That altitude gives you visibility, but ground level gives you surprise. That speed at low altitude provides better protection than maneuverability at high altitude. That terrain is a weapon if you know how to use it properly. The specific aircraft changed as technology advanced. The weapons got exponentially more sophisticated, but the core concept of using terrain and speed to achieve tactical surprise against ground targets remains fundamentally unchanged from what three P-47 pilots discovered on September 27, 1943, when they dove to 200 feet over France and realized they'd found something that worked. The psychological legacy might be even more important than the tactical one. The hedge-hopping campaign proved that conventional wisdom could be catastrophically wrong. That doctrine written in peacetime might need to be completely discarded when people start dying at unacceptable rates, and that sometimes the right answer is the one that sounds completely insane to everyone who hasn't tried it. Hub Zemke never faced a court-martial for his unauthorized tactical experiments. Instead, he received the Distinguished Service Cross and recognition as one of the most innovative tactical thinkers the Army Air Forces produced. The organization internalized a cultural lesson about innovation under pressure. When faced with unacceptable casualties, you don't just do the same thing harder and hope for better results. You question fundamental assumptions, test alternatives regardless of how crazy they sound, and empower junior officers to experiment with new approaches. That institutional flexibility became part of American air power culture in ways that persist to the present. Walk through the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and you'll find a P-47 Thunderbolt suspended from the ceiling in the World War II gallery. The placard discusses high-altitude bomber escort missions and the massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine and the 850 caliber machine guns, all historically accurate information, but incomplete. The real story of the Thunderbolt, the legacy that changed aerial warfare, is that it became most dangerous when it flew lowest, when pilots pointed that massive nose at the ground instead of the sky, when it transformed from a high-altitude interceptor into a hedge-hopping predator that taught an entire generation how to fight at the altitude where physics and surprise mattered more than traditional aerial combat doctrine. 7 months of experimentation, 50 feet of altitude, a willingness to question every assumption and try something that sounded suicidal. That's how American pilots turned the tables on the Luftwaffe and helped win the air war over Europe, one low-level pass at a time.